Nothing is more persuasive to the human mind than a story. So if you want to get better at persuading people, you have to learn how to tell better stories. But telling stories in business settings is a lot different than the way you would tell stories to your friends. Because you're not just trying to entertain people, you're trying to persuade them at the exact same time. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 3 techniques you can use to tell more persuasive stories in business settings right away. I promise by the end of this video, you're going to be thinking differently about how you'll persuade somebody next time you go into a meeting. By the way, I'm Brent. I've spent over 15,000 hours studying how to better communicate with people, and I've used what I've learned to help my clients generate over $46 million in enterprise value inside of their own companies. Let's dig into this. When you're telling stories in business settings, you have to hook your audience fast, and that's where you can use a technique that I call the reverse punchline. And this is where you start your story with one statement that summarizes everything that's coming after that. And this can't be a boring statement. To make this statement interesting, there are 3 components. The first is it has to build curiosity, where your listener wants to know how the story is going to unfold. It's also got to build intrigue, where you're not really sure how it's going to happen. And third, you've got to raise the stakes of the entire story, because that's going to increase emotional attachment and get people to hear you to the end. I want to give you an example of how this goes down in real time. And some of the best storytellers on the planet are stand-up comedians. So watch this clip and see what Bert Kreischer does right here.
When I was 22, I got involved with the Russian mafia. Here's how it happened.
Bert's less than 5 seconds into that story and you're already hooked. You want to know how he got into the Russian mafia, and you're not really sure how everything is going to go down. And of course, the stakes are raised because we're talking about an international crime ring. Now, you probably don't have that juiciest stuff to put in your story about your business or your idea, but you can use the same framework. So let's break this down to how you can tactically implement it. There are 2 parts to this framework. The first is you have to let your audience know a story is coming by using a phrase like, "Let me tell you about." Now, the blank space after that is where you fill in with your thing, remembering that it's got to build curiosity, create intrigue, and raise the stakes. And that can seem challenging, especially if you feel like you've got a boring thing that you talk about. But all you've got to do is zoom in on one little detail and then zoom out to the macro problem. Let me give you an example of this using accounting, because I can't think of anything more boring than telling a story about accounting. Here goes. Let me tell you about the time when I realized that almost every company was making the same exact mistake that data entry clerks were making at Fortune 100 companies that cost those companies $16 billion last year. All I did there was zoom in on the little problem, which was the error that these data entry clerks were making. But then I zoomed out to the macro problem, which is how much it was costing those companies to have this one little error. Then I layered in intrigue by saying this is happening at almost every company. So within that one reverse punchline, I've got the audience's curiosity because they want to know what the mistake is. I've built up their intrigue because they're not really sure if it's happening at their company. And I've raised the stakes because I told them exactly how much this problem is costing. Once you have their attention with the reverse punchline, now you have to keep their attention by getting them emotionally involved in the story. This is where you can use a technique I call mirrored emotion. And that's where you draw your audience into becoming emotionally involved in the story by seeing themselves in the main character, which in this case is probably you, since you're the one telling the story. If they can see the common traits, common desires, and common struggles that they have in the main character, they're naturally going to get more emotionally involved because they can see themselves in that character. Since there are so many traits, desires, and struggles that somebody in your audience could have, it's important we zoom out here and focus on the universal traits, desires, and struggles that we all have as part of being human. To give you an example of this, I'm going to share a story from my friend Oren Klaff's book, Pitch Anything. Now, I'll drop in a little ways into this story so you can see how he's relating the common traits, the common desires, and common struggles to a very uncommon situation. The story starts with him taking off in a private jet, climbing up to 9,000 feet, and then immediately going into a nosedive. Let's drop into Oren's story right here. We drop 1,000 feet in a few seconds. My seat's facing forward towards the cockpit. The doors open and I can see the pilots. We're all clinging to our seats and cursing, and one of the pilots is saying, "It's the TCAS, it's the TCAS." But I didn't even know what a traffic collision avoidance system was. I'm trying to figure all this out, and I'm thinking, this is it, I'm done. Most people haven't been on a private jet, but they can still see themselves in Oren's story because they have the common trait of being terrified if they were in a similar situation. They also have the common desire in wanting to avoid death, and they've got the common struggle in trying to make sense of it while all of this stuff is happening around them. So let's break this down to how you can tactically implement it into your own stories. First, you've got to pick one common trait you're almost certain everybody in your audience is going to have. Kind of like how Oren introduced being terrified into the story I just read you. Then you have to layer on a specific desire that they would likely have in the same type of situation. So since you're telling a business story here, something like trying to meet a deadline or get a new client would both work well at this point in your story. Finally, you've got to introduce some struggle, something that happens that could prevent the main character from achieving what they desire. That could be something like the power going out at a critical moment or getting to the gate right as they're closing the doors to a plane. Both of those would work well there as well. By the way, Oren did live through that whole story. If you want to pick up a copy of his book and read the rest of it, I linked it in the description to this video. The last technique I want to share with you today is the most powerful one at keeping your audience's attention all the way to the very end. And it's not that hard to do, but it is a little nuanced because you have to use a technique called open loop communication. This is where you end your audience's curiosity about one thing, but then immediately give them a new thing to be curious about right after. What's happening here is you're constantly building tension, then releasing it, and then building tension right back up. One of the best examples of this is from the movie Back to the Future in one of the final scenes where they're trying to get Marty back to 1985. We're gonna drop into the clip right after the DeLorean died and Doc is trying to connect the wire that's gonna drop the lightning directly into the flux capacitor. The reason we're so glued to that story is because we think that everything worked out, but then immediately a new obstacle pops up and we've got to stick around to see how that one works out. So let's talk about how to break this down for you to tactically implement it. The entire framework looks like this. The character is facing an obstacle. The character overcomes that obstacle, but then immediately faces a new obstacle. So the first thing you need to do is build tension by introducing uncertainty into your story. So for example, let's say you're telling a story about needing to hit a deadline for a big project, and there are 2 or 3 things that have to line up perfectly in order for you to successfully hit that deadline, but you're not really sure if those are going to happen. We've introduced uncertainty. Next, we have to release that tension by telling the story, in this example, that the stars aligned and we got the project done right on time. But then immediately, and by immediate, I'm talking about in the same breath, we've got to add tension back into the story. So following that example, we got the project done on time and we were just going to take it over to the client to present it, and we pulled out our phone to get Uber, and we realized there were no cars around within 15 minutes of where we are, and the client was expecting us in 15 minutes. See, the listener thought everything worked out, but then immediately a new challenge was faced, and naturally they're going to have to stick around to see how the rest of the story ends. So that's it. If you want to get better at telling persuasive stories, all you've got to do is start your story with one statement that summarizes the entire thing using the reverse punchline technique. Then get your audience emotionally involved by letting them see themselves in the story using the mirrored emotion technique. And then finally, keep them engaged until the end of your story by communicating in open loops. If you keep doing those things and practice them a little bit, I promise you, you are going to be telling some of the most persuasive stories of your life. Thanks for watching the video. If you know somebody that you feel like could use a little bit better persuasion techniques, it would be grateful if you would share this video with them. The more people see it, the more people can use it, and that's exactly what we're after here. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you on the next one.